Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Anthropuzzled podcast. I'm your host, Abby Letzinger, and every 2 weeks we'll explore how anthropologists are forging unique career paths beyond the usual academic sphere. Tune in, get inspired, and start piecing together your own career puzzle within the world of anthropology. On today's episode, we have Dr. Haley Ragsdale, a biological anthropologist interested in how the past and present environment shape health across the life course. She graduated from Northwestern University with a master's and PhD in anthropology, and from Temple University with a bachelor's in anthropology, specializing in the human biology track. She currently works as a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Illinois Chicago, researching how factors like climate change and economic stress get under the skin to affect our biology and health. How are you doing today, Haley?
Good. I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. How are you?
I am doing amazing. I'm so excited to be able to talk to you about this. So even though the podcast is mainly focusing on jobs or careers that one can get with an anthropology degree outside of academia, I think it's super important to still talk to those who are within academia, just to provide some perspective on, what that is like. So what exactly is a postdoctoral research associate, and what do you do?
Yeah, so a postdoctoral research associate, most of us just refer to ourselves as postdocs. Postdoctoral scholar or researcher might also be like a common phrase, but essentially the role of the postdoctoral sort of phase in your academic training is as a transitional period between the sort of more supervised training of your graduate program and being a fully independent investigator or fully independent scholar, with as a professor with your own lab or, your own research group if you're not in a field where they have labs per se. So it's kind of a stepping stone with more independence in your work, but you are still usually supervised by a more senior assistant or associate or sometimes a full professor who is giving you a little bit more guidance specifically tailored to generally preparing you to be a fully fledged professor within academia usually. But there are some postdoctoral research positions that are through industry, so research-oriented companies sometimes will post postdoctoral research positions that are more tailored towards their pipeline of preparing them to do, policy-focused research and things like that. But usually it's an academic sort of track.
Okay. So a postdoctoral research position is generally after you have defended your dissertation and you have received a PhD. Is that right?
Yes. So while it's very common in academia to be applying for these things before you've defended, generally any postdoctoral position that you were offered or would accept would be contingent upon you successfully defending your PhD, and with the understanding that you would have it, not necessarily degree in hand before you start, but that you would have successfully passed your defense and be, you can, if you don't have the degree in hand yet, but you have to start really soon. I know people who have done this. Usually you'll just get some kind of a letter or some sort of formal certification that you have indeed passed the requirements for the degree so that you can start. But yes, it is particularly for those who have received their terminal degree.
Okay. So what was your foci for your research during your PhD grad school experience?
So it's funny because I think this is probably fairly common, at least in my neck of anthropology and bio, but it sort of changed over the course of the program. I came in a little bit more interested specifically in testing out, understanding what's going on with immunity and pregnancy in subsistence level, tropical populations. And that shifted a little bit to become actually broader and just more general, looking at influences that are generally external. So that can be anything that's broadly environment. So nutrition, stress, that can be immune, ecological stuff like pathogen exposure, but just generally experiential environmental effects on the way that we grow and develop and the way that kind of forms a pattern and shapes the trajectory of our lives. So looking at specifically early life. By that, I just mean pre-adult life. So from birth up to even, your early 20s, how those cumulative experiences sort of inform a biological strategy that then will impact potentially reproductive investment and therefore the next generation. So building up that kind of intergenerational effect through looking at the mechanisms at each step. So that became my focus by the end. But I very much just entered grad school being like, I think that pregnancy is really interesting and that's what I want to know about. And I think it's weird and cool and there's a lot of weird stuff going on. So it kind of evolved.
Okay. Was this interest just based out of previous research you may have done like during undergrad or grad school, or just personal experience with like people that you know?
It really came out of my coursework, my experience as an undergraduate. I had a really great time. I love Temple University. They didn't have a super active undergraduate research program there in biological anthropology. So I didn't actually have very many undergraduate research experiences, but I took some really incredible classes. And I took this class that was, I believe, called The Evolution of Human Reproduction. And that really just kind of kicked everything off for me. It was just such a fascinating way of looking at things that I've always been very kind of weird and interesting and whoa, crazy biology. But I think the hook for me was seeing it's not weird for no reason. These are many of these weird things that we see about pregnancy or any kind of reproductive function, even just, menstruation. Many of these things are responses, I should say, to very particular, interesting evolutionary problems. And that really hooked me. So a lot of my initial ideas coming into graduate school were sort of informed by even just, topics we talked about in my classes or things that I sort of made a stab at, writing a term paper about that I then expanded on in graduate school. But yeah, it was just taking some really cool classes with some cool professors that kind of just was I don't want to stop learning about this, especially because I feel like I didn't find the answer. You write a term paper or whatever, but it's all kind of based on existing literature and it's just your hunch. But if you want to, without that research experience or that research opportunity there, if you want to contribute something new to the conversation, then you kind of need to go off to graduate school. So that's what I decided to do.
So learning about, take that class that you took in undergrad, for example, was it speaking of just reproductive things just within the United States, domestically, or did it include how other cultures, deem pregnancy and all that kind of stuff?
The focus of that course was very zoomed out, so it didn't have a ton of examples about specific, there were case examples that were probably across a range of contexts, but most of the focus was sort of humans compared to other animals and humans in this very sort of deep time evolutionary context and the kinds of challenges that human reproduction faces, a lot of which are not super unique to humans. So, some of the focus would be on the great apes, where we share a lot of reproductive similarities with, chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos. So there were fewer specific examples from across global populations, but I did find a lot of really interesting content there later on. Some of the courses I took in graduate school got to that, but it was kind of more of a primer on why it's interesting that these things have evolved that way and what kinds of pressures are going on, and just some basics on, the biology of pregnancy and things like that.
Okay. With your focus on maternal and fetal health, I see you had done a report which was mostly data driven.
Yeah, so that's currently the context in which I'm working at UIC. So my postdoctoral supervisor, Dr. Catherine Starkweather, has a long-running, field-based, community-based survey project in Bangladesh. And the Shotagor are a sort of semi-nomadic rural community with sort of ethnic minority within the broader Bangla population or Bangladeshi population. And she set up this project 10 years ago for her own dissertation research, just to understand a little bit more about community health and how the division of labor and things like women's work and sort of economic choices impacted their own health and that of their children, just because changing economic circumstances and market integration are really huge sort of factors that are driving health trends in a lot of rural and subsistence or, traditionally horticulturalist type populations. The Shotagor were traditionally boat living and fishers, but now a lot of the particularly a lot of the women in those communities, have switched over to selling and trading, essentially kind of like a almost door-to-door sales type of thing, where they're walking really long distances with baskets on their heads and they're selling goods all day long, which is a form of work that is really incompatible with like childcare, for example, versus the traditional life ways. There is, you're on a boat, your kids can be on the boat, you're fishing, you're pulling up nets, and, it's physically taxing for sure, but you can just have your kids kind of sitting there or running around. If you're still breastfeeding, that's relatively easy to do while you're still working, versus with trading, you have to leave your kids at home. So that was the context in which she started the project. And that's still, I think, the broader context that informs the interests and the sort of challenges of that study population. And so I've been helping her for the last 10 months now. I started in January, and we're looking at things like those economic pressures I mentioned, but also newer sort of dynamics that are really starting to have an impact, like climate change on maternal child family health.
So with the individuals that are living in Bangladesh, now is this something that is common through, I don't want to say like third world countries, but underdeveloped countries of where, they're having to leave their kids behind so that they can go work, and it's causing what is the word for it?
It's definitely causing a lot of tension and a lot of sort of new challenges, I think, for the communities. I think generally the idea that market integration, which is kind of just a broad umbrella term for essentially a market-based economy that involves buying and selling and the use of cash for goods and things like that is has been for a while now, obviously, but is sort of spreading all over to the farthest reaches of the globe and to places that were previously not really using that system and pretty isolated from it. And so market integration is a really big concern for a lot of folks who work on things like indigenous health or rural subsistence-based populations. There's so many places that previous era of anthropology we would consider to be like indigenous or like low contact or not, very separate socially, economically from like the sort of Western civilization, or more accurately, like a post-industrial society. But even the most remote places that we know of, most of them now have some degree of market integration, where it's like they might still be practicing some forms of traditional food gathering, like horticulture or hunting, but they might also have like a small store in their village that sells like Coca-Cola. And they might be having like a lot of soda and packaged foods that are entering the communities. So those things vary based on the context, but generally it means like the sort of influx of having to rely more on cash and other things, that those sort of processes also do displace their traditional forms. So it's not just a preference for that, it's really just that those become a lot more tenable as economic strategies than your traditional fishing, especially when, things like climate change and urban and rural transformations can make there's less fish than there used to be in the river. So those are kind of like the broader dynamics that are playing out, I think, in a lot of like rural places.
Okay, so it's kind of a little bit of like westernization, and
yeah,
tourism is bringing this Western culture into these more traditional rural populations, and it's starting to have some kind of effect nutrition-wise and economic and just environmentally to those kind of populations.
Yeah, for sure. The tourism angle can really vary based on where you're at. I know that a lot of places in Central and East Africa where people do work with like local communities, they might experience more of those like ecotourism impacts. That's also, I think, a common sort of relevant factor in, I know, Central America for a lot of like sort of indigenous or subsistence level societies there, because there are a lot of really interesting and fascinating from like a global history perspective things like, ruins, or in East Africa and Central Africa, there are, these large, wildlife reserves that people want to go see. And often people who are local to those areas can find work participating in that tourism economy. So guided tours and things like that. But those things, have a flip side as well of sort of creating just sort of really seismic changes in the economy that are harder to notice, right at the start, but do sort of have those impacts over time. So really what Katie and I are looking at or sort of are interested interested by in the Shodigor population is this idea that women's work, which has been very commonly used throughout global health and public policy messaging for, since at least the 70s here, but more recently across the globe, as this idea that women's work is very liberatory, and women's freedom to work and be like work outside of the home specifically can be a source of economic freedom and autonomy for women. And that in itself is usually seen as a good thing for families. But there's also this sort of overlooked side of it, which is that, unless there are really robust community and like kin care systems in place, women going out of the house to work usually means that they're not at home taking care of the kids. And so unless someone else steps up to take on that new role, you have this kind of, catch-22 of like, well, can women have it all or not? And that's something that we definitely confronted or started to realize in this country, like in the 70s and 80s, where you had that big scare of like, sure, it's great that women are working now, but like, what about all these kids that are home alone all day? And that has like a lot of social impacts as well. So it's, we're looking at that through a different lens of sort of, it's more ongoing right now, at least in Bangladesh.
Yeah, and that's something that's been up for debate many times, especially within the United States, is we don't have so much of a sense of community here. It's very an individualistic mindset. So it is great that women are going out and working. And it's almost essential at this point because with the economy, it's hard to rely on one individual's salary anymore, but also the cost of childcare is just astronomical. So it's hard to make that decision. It's also a very personal decision for anybody who does make the decision. But anyways, so getting into more of kind of like, I guess not the current work that you've done, but let's talk about your dissertation, which was on the developmental influences on reproductive investment, linking maternal nutritional history with pregnancy, metabolism, and fetal growth. Lots of big words. Would you be able to define kind of what that means?
Definitely, yeah. So as with most academic titles, it's a mouthful. There's, a colon, which may or may not be necessary. But really what is attempting to describe, and it did take me a while to like land on a name. I just was like, there's no great way to say it that's not a mouthful. But really the idea of looking at developmental influences on reproductive investment is just that, kind of what I got at the beginning, which is just to say that I ended up looking mostly at nutrition as a sort of mechanistic lens, but really it's just about kind of how do chronic experiences, so not just one traumatic thing or one, really positive thing, but how does the sort of sum total of life experiences inform the development of offspring through the sort of pathway of pregnancy biology? So developmental influences really just means stuff that happens from conception to, your early 20s. And, reproductive investment, in my case, specifically, I looked at metabolic strategy. So like different metabolic measures that I measured in the sort of third trimester biomarker samples from pregnant women. So we were able to get dried blood spots from the population that I did this research in, which is the Cebu Longitudinal Health and Nutrition Survey cohort, which is not something that I had any hand in setting up. It's a very established, long-running nutrition and growth-related survey that has been running for 40 years in Cebu, which is a city in the Philippines, or Metro Cebu, really. So Cebu City and the surrounding areas. So we had blood spots that you just prick the side of someone's finger and you let it drop onto a card, and those can just dry at room temperature, and then they're really quite stable for years. So it's a really, really powerful way of measuring any kind of biomarker that you can, make it work with, because you don't have to have a huge freezer that you're lugging around. It doesn't spoil. You don't need specially coated tubes like you do with whole blood if you were going to be doing venipuncture. Venipuncture and drawing blood that way requires a trained phlebotomist to do it. And it's relatively invasive, and it's not something that everyone is going to be willing to have done. Mm-hmm. So, a finger prick, it's very similar to how folks who are watching their blood sugar would use a handheld microlancet to just do that themselves. That's the amount of pain and the amount of pressure that it exerts. So using those, I was able to look at, metabolic markers in pregnancy. And then we have birth outcomes. So birth weight, birth length, head size, all of those things from the children that were born from those pregnancies. And then I can kind of put together I could link all of these together and fill out the bigger picture of, we have data on these women from when they were born up to their 20s. And then we have data from their pregnancy, and then we have their babies, like basic measures. So that is kind of the thread that I was attempting to string with that broader project, and also what I was attempting to capture when I had to come up with a name for an 8-chapter dissertation.
Right. And so how did that go? Were you able to link those together or draw that string?
Yes. Yeah, I think I was able definitely to put together the picture, as with like so many things in science or just in scholarship more generally. It's not so much about whether or not all of your predictions came out to be correct, but really more just that you did the work correctly, and that you it was, even if you were wrong on some of your predictions, if it's valid science, and that in itself is that is the contribution, I think, to the scientific body of work and, like human knowledge. So most of my predictions ended up being correct, but I, ultimately did find that things like your rate of growth, so not just how, the number on the scale, for example, but a more sort of computationally complex, but ultimately just a sort of conditional growth measure that sort of is similar to weight velocity. We were able to sort of get a sense of relatively how fast were you putting on weight. And that includes height. It's not so much that how much you weigh matters. I'm much more interested in using height and weight as two different dimensions that kind of just encompass how much effort your body is putting into building stuff. So basically, I found that conditional growth, the faster rate of conditional growth relative to your past growth, so if you're speeding up growth or you're slowing down, was associated with larger head size in offspring and with longer babies. So those are measures that are kind of reflecting lean mass. So longer baby really just means you say long because babies can't stand up, but in an older person that would just be height. So taller and bigger head sizes are brain growth, and your ultimate height that you're able to achieve is sort of dependent upon these things as well. So if you're born longer, you're probably going to achieve a taller adult stature, although it's, things like nutrition are incredibly important as well. But what was interesting is that we found no effects on birth weight, newborn birth weight, or body fat. So we have, little calipers that you can use to measure how chubby a baby's arms are and how chubby their side is. And you use that to create a sum of skin fold thicknesses, which is a pretty robust indicator of general subcutaneous fat in a newborn, which is incredibly important, obviously, for, both pre and postnatal health and survivorship for babies. Babies are very fat for a reason. So it was interesting to not see any effect on fat is our number one line of defense when we're babies against cold, against, nutritional deficits. It really buffers our brain growth when we are at a really vulnerable stage. So that tends to be the most the first one to decline if there is a stressful or a nutritional deficit. You would usually see, if in a short-term influence, you would see body fat taking that hit first in order to protect something really important like the brain from having to take that hit. So that concept is called brain sparing. It's just the idea that if a woman suddenly is in a total famine situation in pregnancy and has no food at all, she's still able to grow a baby of the appropriate size with a functioning brain. It'll just probably, depending on when it happens in pregnancy, it might be skinnier, but it will still have appropriate brain function, because that's really the most important thing for human survivorship and appropriate function. So that was weird. And I think it's always really fun to find something weird, to find effects on something that is usually so unaffected by things. Something so important as brain growth kind of says okay, there's something different going on here, but there is something going on. It's not a null result. We actually found an opposite result. So that kind of sparked the rest of my dissertation, which was ultimately about trying to find out why that happened and what caused that. And I still don't fully know how it happened, but I think I have a sense as to potentially why.
Okay. And do you think you'll ever research that more in depth in the future?
I think I would like to. Research, once you're done your dissertation, it kind of feels like you're being pulled in so many different directions with research. There's people who are suggesting collaborations. And, as a postdoc, you're also working on your supervisor's work and like coming up with new ideas with them. But it's definitely still on my plate. I still feel that it's like a really motivating question for me. And so I do feel the desire to, like solve that. And that might not be ultimately possible, but I definitely have some plans for what I'm going to test next. Even if I don't ever fully find the answer, I have a few more things I'm going to try first.
Okay. And what was the like PhD or grad school experience like for you? Like whether it was application process or finding advisors, the research you did before getting into grad school, what was that like?
Yeah, so I think for me, I had a vague sense that you were supposed to email people and ask sort of if they're accepting students, and like you email them sort of a short-ish cold email that essentially says, here's what I'm interested in, here's what I'm thinking about. Are you accepting students and would you be interested in talking? I think that I don't remember how I learned about that. I think I probably asked some of my professors from my courses, like, I want to go to grad school, how do I do it? Probably did some Googling on my own. So I did that. Essentially, my process for deciding who to email came down to really picking out some of the papers that I was really, really interested in that I read in class and like looking at the authors and then deciding they were like still, if it was an older paper and they're still actively like doing work, they're still under the age of like 80. Because there's some really exciting like foundational papers that I was like, oh, this is cool. And then, my professor's like, that person's like retired. They're not, you need to find someone younger. So I just found those folks. And then there was a shorter process of being like, okay, is that somewhere they would realistically want to go? If it's like in the middle of nowhere or something, like I had some level of being like, I would want to live here, maybe not here. But generally I just kind of picked out a few people who I really felt like I was interested in their work and I could find a way to like find something of my own that would also be interesting to them. And then I ended up, emailed, I think I applied to 4 programs. I applied to Yale, Northwestern, the University of California at Santa Barbara, and Arizona State, which are all very like well-known, sort of well-regarded schools for biological anthropology. Like they all have really good programs. And I got into Northwestern, Arizona State, and UC Santa Barbara. And now that I'm remembering it, I actually never finished my application to Yale. But it's because I decided that it might not be the best fit. I did go through, I emailed a professor there who was very, very lovely. And she actually invited me to come visit. So this was something that I was only able to do because I was in Philadelphia and Yale is in Connecticut. The others, I wouldn't have been able to just do that. I did visit them after I was accepted, but this was kind of just like a few weeks after I emailed her. She was like, hey, come up and just check it out, which was really nice and was really cool chance to sort of like sit in on a course that she taught and go to like the group's lab meeting, hang out with some of the folks who were there. So that was something that I didn't know was an option and I wouldn't have asked about if she hadn't offered, but I would say is something that I would definitely recommend if there's somewhere that's like near you, if you are someone who would, be interested in going to a graduate program and it's somewhat, within a couple of hours of where you live, just see if there's an opportunity for you to like go to a lab meeting or like check it out before you go through the process of applying. So ultimately I didn't end up applying because although it was a really lovely experience, I was able to chat more with the professor and get a sense of where her current research direction was. And it was not really, it was kind of moving away from the work of hers that I was really interested in, which had been like, 10 years ago. And her new direction wasn't as like compatible with my work. So I ended up deciding that it didn't make a lot of sense for me to apply to work with her. So I think that's another important thing because so often, like as a student or someone who's not in that world, you see a paper and you're like, this is so cool, but there's a chance that they're not actually working on that topic anymore. So that's something that's important to keep in mind as well.
Okay. Yeah, and that's definitely something that I'm seeing a lot more of with the individuals I interview is make sure you're talking to the advisors that you might have if you attend the school to ensure that their research aligns with what you want to do, seeing like what other past grads have said, how like their style is, do they get things done on time, do you have to kind of send them reminder emails every week? So yes, doing research is very important. So with being a postdoctoral or a postdoc, what does a postdoc make? Because I'm assuming they're working either with grants or they're working under like a university, which tends to not pay as much as you would hope they would. But what's something that they like make for salary?
Yeah, as you alluded to, it does depend slightly on the source of funding. So there is this sort of terminology that's common in academia of like soft money versus hard money. Soft money basically means that your pay is coming from a grant that usually has like a sort of end date, whereas hard money kind of indicates that your pay is baked into the institution. You're getting paid usually by that institution. You're not getting paid from a grant. So I am a postdoctoral research associate, which is hard money, which means that I'm getting paid by the university and I am a university employee. I have a friend who is a postdoctoral fellow, which is soft money paid through an NIH grant. Every other aspect of our day-to-day is fairly similar. Our responsibilities are the same, but slightly different job title, a different sort of like behind the scenes source for the money. And unfortunately, because it's NIH, they set what they pay postdocs. So they make like, I think 61 or something like that. Whereas the higher end of what you would make with hard money at an institution is closer to like 65. But also these are both relatively good, potentially indicative of being in a larger city. I think sometimes, especially if it's just being set by an institution and not like a federal institution like the NIH, which, can be frustrating if you're doing the same job as someone else and getting not quite as much money, but also it's kind of like a baseline. So if you're getting that money, but you live in like Alabama, it's like I'm still getting this salary, which is supposed to be for anywhere in the United States, because a lot of sort of salaries will, on the whole, kind of follow the trends of like cost of living most places. Ideally. I mean, they don't always for sure. But yeah, I would say as a postdoc, so I make $65,000 a year as a postdoctoral research associate, which is, I think, the higher end of the band. So that's like there's a cap above that, beyond which that's all we're gonna allot. So I think the lower end is like 54. So 50 to 65, my understanding is like that's like a broad range for what postdocs are generally making within the United States. I've seen some sort of opportunities like that in Europe that are, like can be 40 to 50,000 euros a year. Generally, most positions, even with the conversion stuff, are going to pay a little bit less in Europe just because, they have more stuff that they get.
Yeah, the benefits.
Yeah, like they get more from just living there. So pay is usually not as much for most jobs I've seen, like including things like doctors and so on. But that's the postdoc range. And then I think, I don't have a tenure track position, but from what I've seen, they tend to start at like 75, 80, 85,000 for an assistant professor position and then go from there, assuming it's like your typical tenure track, like teaching, research, service type of job.
Would you go into being the tenure track professor route, or are you strictly wanting to kind of stay into research?
So for most folks who are in your classic academia track, staying in research generally means you do seek out a faculty position because for better or for worse, like that's how the system is designed, which I know leads to a lot of frustration for like undergraduates where if you have a course where you're like, my professor really sucks at teaching. And it's usually because most academic professors were not hired like for their teaching skills. It is a bigger and bigger component, I think nowadays, like every job that I have seen that's like on my radar to apply for, they do want a teaching statement. I think they're like, that's maybe a bit more important now than it was a generation ago.
Right.
But it was traditionally seen as like, you get the job, part of what you do is you teach courses, and, it's like a third courses, a third research, a third service, which just means like sitting on committees and helping out in the department and that kind of stuff. So at certain types of colleges, like liberal arts colleges, primarily undergraduate colleges, you might do almost entirely teaching and very little research, versus at a lot like a big like R1 research focused university with a lot of graduate students with a lot of money coming in and out of their graduate programs. You'll do research, some teaching, and then the full professors, as you get more senior, you usually are able to do less teaching. So currently right now my plan is I am on the job market, which is basically just what it's called when you're anywhere from like 1 to 2 years from completing your PhD to at any point in a postdoc. It just kind of means like, yeah, I'm looking, if I see something, I'll apply. Sometimes you're more specific, like you're more one-track mind on the job market. Like you don't have a current thing that your position. My position has a hard stop date of the end of 2025. So I'm currently applying to some faculty positions that would start usually in the fall of 2025. And then if you get an opportunity or an offer, you have a chance to sort of negotiate. You can say like, hey, is it okay if I push this back by a couple months to finish out my current postdoc? Or sometimes if they're not able to do that, you can also talk to your postdoctoral supervisor and say, hey, is it okay if I sort of finish this up a little bit early for this faculty position I was offered? And I mean, maybe it's not 100% guarantee, but I would say 99% of the time, your postdoctoral supervisor will be like, that's amazing. You have a job offer. That's totally fine, of course. So the weird timelines, usually, if people are willing to work with you a little bit, they can be managed. But yeah, so right now I have over a year left of my current position, but I am applying for faculty jobs because they have a pretty long lead time for those applications.
Okay. With being in grad school, for someone who is maybe not wanting to go as far as a PhD, in your opinion, based on your experiences, do you think a master's is enough to do research, or do you feel like PhD tracks might help a bit more in getting the position someone might want in a research field?
I think it really depends. I think it depends on what type of work you want to do. I know that, for example, getting a terminal master's degree is more common in fields like archaeology. So that, for bios, that could be bioarchaeology. There's a lot of master's programs that are out there for forensic anthropology specifically. Things like that, where it's a more targeted, like a professional, so you have like a sort of destination in mind for what you're wanting to do. So for bioarchaeology or forensic anthropology or even regular archaeology, there are sort of particular professions where that's totally fine for what they're looking for. If you just are going to be like a municipal forensic anthropologist, they often work with coroners, things like that. Or bioarchaeology or general archaeology are really sort of surprisingly relevant and useful for both a municipal and like larger scale, not state, federal kind of projects, for a lot of times for building. If you live in an area that has a history of documented anyway, sort of development and occupation, or a settlement, I should say, then like any kind of building project will usually have some kind of preliminary surveying phase. Very common in Europe because, anytime you want to build anything, there's probably going to be incredibly cool ruins. But also within the United States, it's very common to have cultural resource management and surveying done to make sure that there's no Native American or indigenous sort of sites that are going to be interfering potentially with whatever building or land use plan was devised. So those kinds of particular fields are totally fine from my experience with a master's degree. So I would say if you have like an idea of what you're interested in doing, then it's definitely worth checking out if that job really requires a master's degree. Like find where that work is being done. If they have a website, usually you can see like people who work there, and sometimes that'll just say like, their basic degrees. And if a lot of them just have master's degrees, that's a good sign. For working specifically, I would say in human biology research, that I have not seen very much evidence that having a master's degree is sufficient to be like having a leading role. That being said, there are tons of very big research programs that are looking for like research associates, research assistants, technical assistants, laboratory technicians. All of those jobs you do not need a PhD to do, and some of them you don't need a master's. So it's, I think, a good opportunity if you're looking to get more experience and see if you like it, then look for things that are like research associate, research assistant, technician, all of those things. Like bigger research programs are going to need lots of those jobs, and it's a good way to get your feet in there and see if you think it's interesting work. Also, if you're interested in something like public health, I don't know as much about their programs, but I would imagine that there's a lot more space there for master's degree. Master of Public Health is its own degree, obviously, but they also, any of these big research programs will also need things like associate research assistants, technicians, things like that.
And I've noticed a lot, it depends on which subfield of anthropology you're getting into, because most biological anthropology, where it's very science-based, it's a lot of the jobs that you are in is going to require some kind of research background. So definitely before getting a master's or getting a PhD, try and get into those fields that you're wanting to work in, even if it's just as much as you're just volunteering there. That way you don't waste the time and the money getting these degrees and be like, I can't do this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially if there is like a component like that, like if you're interested in forensics, make sure that you can deal with blood and bodies and stuff, especially if a lot of the day-to-day work of forensics, it's not just in the morgue, you might be at like a really, the scene of like a car crash or something. So make sure you can deal with that. I know for the perspective of archaeology, bioarchaeology, paleoanthropology, which is more specifically about excavating like ancient human ancestors, those kinds of things is like, if you want to do that, try some way to get some kind of field experience, which you don't need to have a master's for. I did a field school for paleoanthropology before I went to grad school, which was like a month, and it was in the Republic of Georgia. And that's a really good way to find out if you like field work. Very often you're going to be living in like pretty rustic accommodations. Like there's going to be, if you're lucky and have running water, it'll be like outdoor showers, things like that. So just to get a sense of if you like, being outside and like roughing it and doing field work versus if that's not like necessarily for you. I didn't mind it, but ultimately I did that and was like, okay, I don't think that's like my favorite thing about biological anthropology. So I came back and kind of switched my focus a little bit to human biology. It's like, it's not that I, hate going outside, but it was more frustrating to me actually, the idea that like of getting up every day and not knowing if you were going to get data. And, like human biology just feels like any person on the planet can be a source of information, of data, of like, any person can be a subject. Like participants are all 7 billion people on the planet, versus paleoanthropology can be a little bit, I think, frustrating because you kind of feel like you're searching for that needle in a haystack. So that was something else that I kind of learned from that field experience, but definitely hard degree. If you, know about yourself, if you don't want to be outside, it's going to be really hard to do most types of archaeology, I would say. Sometimes you can do indoors archaeology. I have a friend who did her PhD and it was all focused on some exterior, but mostly like building structures in England and the sort of reuse of ancient materials. So, she was kind of like walking around villages and like looking at the outsides of buildings and then going in and like having tea with people and like getting to look at like the beams in their house. So obviously nothing is for sure. You don't have to, but she also did, her fair share of digging in fields before that too. I don't have any issues with blood. I don't always like have to work with blood. I also often work with dried blood. So it's like maybe that makes a difference if you have a thing about blood. Like you can find other ways. You're totally, able to do research with like saliva and hair, urine, feces. Like it's all gonna be body stuff. So yeah, that's an issue. Like take that into account. But if you have a blood thing, there are other ways for sure.
Do you ever get worried about like bloodborne pathogens, or is it different because it's dried?
I think it's different because it's dried. It's not as high of a security risk. But that being said, we do still do, like you have your bloodborne pathogens training if you're doing lab work. You wear gloves. The viral infection risk is like the lowest possible when you're working. Like you're not researching a disease. So there's no known disease agents anywhere around and you're working with dried blood. That's like the lowest like level of biohazard lab. I forget the types, but we're the second lowest maybe. So, we don't have to wear necessarily like respirators or masks in the lab. We don't have to wear even coats really if we don't want to, unless I suppose if you're clumsy. But we do wear gloves, like the baseline stuff. Yeah, like you follow the safety protocols, you dispose of sharps in the appropriate biohazard container, don't lick stuff, But I've never felt like, oh, I'm really worried. Like, I don't ever work with materials that, like, if I spilled them on me and I didn't have, like, an open wound, it would be an issue. You would just, like, rinse it off and move on. So that's good.
Yeah. Well, before we get to our final 4 questions, is there anything we haven't discussed already that you would like to talk about?
I don't think so. I would just say that if folks are listening to this because they are interested in this field, then I have, some like, I guess, tips or things that maybe would have helped me as far as not so much things that if I had known before going into graduate school, I would have done differently, more just things that maybe take a while to realize and it's good to have a heads up, which is mostly just knowing yourself and how you work best. It's a very independent type of unstructured work, which can be challenging if you have like ADHD or other types of like learning differences or difficulties or anything like that. If you have external care responsibilities, that can be a really big challenge. Obviously, as we mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, like having a community or kin support network is huge for that. Not just for like women who are going out selling stuff, but for any type of working person, you have support. Otherwise, that's going to be a big help. But yeah, for me, it was a lot about like the challenges that I had to overcome were finding ways to motivate myself, finding a balance between like self-confidence and ambition and like humility and flexibility, which is, I think challenging for anyone, especially folks who were raised and socialized as girls or women. Like that self-confidence, ambition thing, like obviously imposter syndrome is like a really big talking point now. But I think a lot of what gets overlooked about imposter syndrome is that like everyone maybe can feel not super confident, but it really has like a material effect more on women and underrepresented minority groups within academia who have the exact same training as that other person, but feel like they're not as qualified. And it's something that is kind of put onto you as well. So that self-confidence and you can be a fairly self-confident person, which I think I generally am, but it's like you have to work extra hard to maintain like a balanced sense of that in academia, which is a very competitive place. Everyone's really smart and successful to varying degrees. So it's like you can't use like shortcuts to feel good about yourself. You have to just generally like have faith that you can do it. And that doesn't mean that you have to have faith that you're better than everyone else, but just that you're like about as good as everyone else. So that stuff I think was a challenge. I also started graduate school fairly young. And I would say that if you're interested in any of these topics, doing things like doing a field experience or working for a year or two as a research technician, things like that are really good confidence boosters as well, because you just know your way around the language and the world a little bit more versus coming straight out of undergrad, which you certainly can do. That's what I did. But I felt a little bit inexperienced compared to a lot of my cohort mates who a lot of them had masters already or had worked in the field and like kind of were just able to speak with a little bit more confidence about what they wanted. So I think that's like always a good option. Yeah, I think that's kind of mostly what I would want to say if I was listening to this myself 8 years ago or whatever it was.
Well, you perfectly answered the very first question is what piece of advice would you give to someone who wants to be in your field? So what changes do you wish to see in the industry of either biological anthropology or just like postdoc research associate positions?
I think the biggest one would just be a little bit more human focused, as in I just wish that academia writ large, postdocing as an institution, I just wish that it could be a little bit more, maybe realistic is a term, because it just feels like so much of the structure of how this works is you do your graduate program and then you get either a faculty position or more likely you do a postdoc or two first. But those postdocs, the expectation is that you will do it in the place that makes the most sense, like intellectually, academically, and that, but sometimes it's just in a random place. And the idea that it's very easy and not burdensome for people to pick up their life and move somewhere for a year or even 2 years to just like get this next experience and then have to start again and maybe go somewhere. The jobs right now that are available, they're all over the country. And it's kind of like, well, those are the 10 jobs that are going to be on the market this year. If you want to live in this place, then and you can apply for it. If you have like a lot of hard deal breakers, if you want to stay somewhere because your family's nearby or you have kids and they're in school here and you need like all of your networks that you've built up, those types of things are really difficult to integrate with having like a successful academic career and not feel as though you're like passing any opportunities by. I think that's another place where like that general sense of self-confidence and like flexibility comes in handy, is a way to stop your brain from constantly being like, am I not making the best career decisions right now? For me, I was very fortunate that I was able to find a postdoctoral position in the same city that I already lived in. And also that it's a very academically and intellectually very like synergistic position, and one where my supervisor is really cool and relaxed and like is fine if I work from home most of the time. But that was like a very fortunate kind of miracle that came up. A lot of folks do feel like their best option is to go somewhere really far away or even to temporarily part ways from like their partner if their partner has a really good job and neither one of them really feels like they're in a position to sort of throw away that career opportunity. I know folks who've discussed like potentially going long distance after living together and being like married and being like, hey, maybe it just makes the most sense for me to go do this for a year. And those conversations are really difficult. And I don't think that people should be really in a position where you have to consider whether you should go long distance from your wedded partner that you've been living and sharing a life with, just because it feels like that's like your only career move. So yeah, I just think that I wish, especially after the pandemic, like there was such a clear sense that remote work is feasible. And I think it's frustrating to see that that is being sort of reeled back a little bit. It's like, you can't put that back in the box. We all know that a lot of this can be done remotely. So yeah, I guess I would just say I would like to see more flexibility with location and understanding that it's really not feasible for folks with a lot of connections, or even if you don't have connections, like you shouldn't, I don't think, be expected to just be like itinerant for most of your 20s and 30s. But especially if you've got family and things like that, it's tough to always like be close to them and feel like you're doing your best for your career.
Right. And I heard it's even worse if like both individuals are academics, but maybe not in the same field. Like it's very unlikely that they're going to get a job at the same university.
Yeah, that's a really big challenge, that even if you are a full professor with like, you know, really a cushy situation, it's still gonna be challenging. If you have a lot of clout, you can try to negotiate with the universities, but it takes years. Those are years that you're feeling kind of like unsure. And I think that general sense of uncertainty is something that, while I wish it would change, in the meantime, is something that someone who's going into academia kind of just needs to find a way to like live with and not hyper focus on. It's just like the general sense of like, I don't know where I'll be this time next year, but in order for me to like do my best work and also just like have a enjoyable life that I can appreciate like all of the good stuff, I have to just not constantly focus about the fact that I don't know where I'll be this time next year. So that's like a work in progress. But yeah, I guess that's also a bonus, is another piece of advice and a change I wish to see.
Yeah. And so what do you absolutely just love about your job?
I love that I can do kind of whatever I want. I mean, I think I can do whatever I want in the sense that what I want is already established to be something that is compatible with this line of work. And the things that I want are like, you know, I've already established that I want to learn more about these topics and I've been hired to do that. But as far as research ideas, truly anything that I could think of and come up with and make an argument for, I would be absolutely within my rights and also within my job description to just go out and pursue it. But I think the amount of intellectual freedom is really, really exciting. And I think that's why, despite all of the like kind of annoying stuff and the uncertainty, is what draws people to it. You know, it's funny, I was feeling, I think, a little bit stressed out a couple of days ago because it's kind of like this is like the crunch time for job applications and stuff. And I was sitting with my partner on the couch and he played this like, you know, YouTube short video. It was a clip from a David Attenborough special, but he was just talking about, you know, some incredible adaptation that they just learned about in like honeybees or bumblebees, about how they have like co-evolved with flowers. And it's funny, like beyond even the specifics of it, it was really interesting. It was like about how bees carry a negative charge and flowers carry a positive charge, and it like attracts the pollen to them. That aside, it was just this sort of reverent way that he was speaking about this like incredible adaptation, this incredible phenomenon of nature. I was like, I feel like I'm getting a bit emotional right now because of how cool that is. And the fact that like that type of feeling that it engenders within you is kind of why I'm doing this, because the freedom of the work stuff is cool, but it's because like there is a job that still exists in the 21st century where you do get to just pursue that feeling, and you have to deal with some logistical stuff around it that can be a real headache and really feels difficult sometimes to make work with like a modern lifestyle. But ultimately, it's just so incredibly invigorating and gratifying to be able to learn about that stuff and pursue it to your heart's content and have that be your job. So that, I think, is probably what I love about it.
I appreciate you coming on here so much. Where can listeners learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. I have a website. It's not the most like up to date. That's also something that I'm always like, gotta work on that a little more. But my website is haleyragsdale.squarespace.com. There was also a semi-recent article that I was interviewed for, came out last year in The Atlantic. I was just one of like several biologists and anthropologists who were interviewed for it, but it's called An Awkward Evolutionary Theory for One of Pregnancy's Biggest Complications by Catherine Wu. So I think it's paywalled, but you can get a free trial if you're just interested in that. She's also written a lot of other really cool stuff in a similar vein. So if you are interested in like the kind of stuff that I do and you like that article, use your free trial to read a lot more of her stuff because she's great. I mean, my work is obviously for an academic audience. I don't think I'm at the point in my career yet where I would be writing like a book. If I ever wrote a book, I think that's the kind of thing you're supposed to do when you're like 65 in academia. But if you think this kind of stuff is cool and interesting, I would recommend that people could check out the PBS Eons YouTube channel, which is sort of about the history of the human species, which is really cool for like an entry-level look. And they just make really great videos, and it's good to support public broadcasting. Yeah. And then I would also recommend the book that I read that made me want to be a biological anthropologist, which is The Story of the Human Body by Daniel Lieberman. I read it in high school and decided that I wanted to be a biological anthropologist and go to grad school. And that's exactly what I did because it was so cool. So I would recommend that book. He's a great writer, so I think he's got more recent stuff that's cool too. And then, yeah, if you're interested in my own stuff, I guess you can also follow my Google Scholar profile, which updates like once or twice a year whenever I put out something new if you really care about the science of it. But yeah, I think that's everything.
Perfect. Yeah. And if anybody is interested in biological anthropology, there's a podcast on Spotify. It's called Anthrobiology by Gabby LaPera. And she interviews all these different biological anthropologists, you know, from those who work with primates, those who work on teeth, bones, all that kind of cool stuff. So if you guys are interested in that at all, give her a listen. She's great. Yeah, it was a great time having you on. If you have any new research like in the coming years, I would love to have you back on.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can check back in if and when I have a different position, whether that's research or faculty or anything else, and I'll give you an update on how that's going.
Right. I would love that. Thank you so much, Haley. Thanks for listening to another episode of Anthropuzzled. This show was produced by me. A special thanks to Cheyenne Brewer for editing the website and episode descriptions, and to Leah Akers for the incredible logo design. The music is courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear of Sound of Picture. If you have any questions, you can reach me at abby.letsinger@anthropuzzled.com. That's abby.letsinger@anthropuzzled.com. Or as Anthropuzzled on Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, or YouTube. Until next time.